Oh, Nancy, I forgot to ask you, would you prefer me to share your presentation and then like I'll just go next when you say it, or did you want to do it on your end and you'll toggle through your presentation?
Doesn't matter if you want to do it on your end, just in case I mess up the screen sharing, because I know it gets finicky sometimes.
Yeah,
And I
yeah.
haven't done Zoom on my iPad, so just to be safe,
Yeah,
please.
okay, so I'll do that on my end for sure.
Thank you.
I have both the presentations up, and then Linda, you said you wanted to go first, but we'll start with you, and then we'll hand it off to Nancy. Hi, everyone, welcome. Let me go ahead and admit more people. We're all super excited to have you here today. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to put in the chat box our sign in. Even if you signed in through the Vision Resource Center for Flex or CPGU credit, please make sure you sign in too. You know, technology, things happen. It's just great to have a sign in sheet as a backup. So I'm going to go ahead and post that into the chat. And so please go ahead and sign in. And then we'll give it a second for people to come in. I'm seeing new people today too. So for those of you who are new and haven't had a chance to attend any of our other events that we've been having, my name is Carla Ruiz. I'm the Cultural Diversity Coordinator here at Glendale Community College and academic counselor. I also teach Student Development 141, and so it's really nice to meet you all and see you all. And I'm really excited for the future events that we have and hope you're able to join us. Go ahead and drop the sign-in sheet again. Please make sure you sign in. Ooh, we got a lot of people coming in. Awesome. Welcome all. Thank you so much for being here. I will be putting in the sign-in sheet in the chat. Awesome. We'll just give it a minute or so before we begin today. Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Nicole, I need you co-host. So if you could just let people in as they come through and then also provide the sign in. Thank you. Thank you so much for everyone for being here today for our Asian Latinx representation and celebration. Today we are joined by our two presenters, Linda Du and Nancy Tiet, to share their story, their background, and their culture with us today. And so without further ado, I'll allow Linda to start off and introduce herself, and we'll get into her story.
Hello, everyone. My name is Linda Du, and I now think it's appropriate to identify what I do as a profession. I am a case manager / counselor at Occidental College. My specialty is working with students with disabilities. So that's a little bit about me. So I will start sharing my story. It's going to be a bit informal. It's much more like a personal narrative story. I identify as, next slide, Mexican and Chinese. So I thought it'd be appropriate to give a little bit of context in showing sort of the difference, which is, I think, a theme of, for me, what it's been to be multiracial or biracial. To me, it's a very significant in telling my story to present my two grandmothers, because they were both an integral part of my development slash, kind of the emergence of my identity formation in terms of my culture. So the education background, I actually am a non-traditional student. That would be, I guess, the definition. So I started my family first, and then decided that I wanted to pursue my career after being a parent. So I started my career journey at Los Angeles City College. I then transferred to Cal State Northridge, where I obtained my bachelor's in psychology. And in the middle picture, you see my two daughters. And for me, that's a very important piece to share in my story, because there's a significant piece of my success. And then lastly, I obtained my master's at Cal State Northridge. My master's is in college counseling and student services. So I really try to think about this question about Latinidad, and I'm kind of giving away my age, but that's okay. I was an adolescent in the 90s, so if I can talk about Latinidad and representation, I will say that during that time, there wasn't a lot of what we see today, like in terms of representation. We didn't have, I'm just going to present shows that I now thoroughly enjoy, because they really are, forthcoming on like education on Latinx, right? And even just Asian culture. So like shows like Gentified, La Gordita Chronicles, things like that, that now I'm like, wow, this would have been a great sort of thing to have during my development, because these kind of things that I had difficulty with in my identity development in terms of being Chinese or being Mexican, there was always like push and pull between both, because I was not Latina enough, because I am very much more Chinese, because I was raised by my dad's side of the family, and I lived in Chinatown. So there's just like a very much feelings of confusion of where do I belong? And of course, identifying with culture, body image and appearance is a big part of that. And so I didn't look like my other counterpart, Asian young women. So it was a very complex experience when I think about Latinidad, because it's a paradox. So with that in mind, I thought it'd be appropriate to sort of discuss like what identity formation in terms of culture has been for me. I think I can present a little bit of theory in saying that, like, with what I recall in my adolescent emergence and starting to become aware of like places that I wanted to be part of, groups that I wanted to belong. I think, ages 13 to 17, I identified predominantly as Asian, because all of the family traditions and food and just like my like immediate environment lend for that experience for me to be able to identify. But as I was developing and becoming a young adult, it was extremely confusing, because I do speak Spanish, but I don't participate in like certain family traditions, or I've never been baptized, I never had a quinceañera. So I always just didn't have my foot quite fully in. So I would say I had some identity confusion in terms of saying I'm Latina or fully Chinese. So it's a theme that's been recurrent. I think that eventually it was education and really redefining what it means to be Latinx Asian, where I realized like, oh, this is not just like a fitting into a box, it's a redefining like, what does that mean to me? And not just in terms of like language or appearance, but like values, and also like the way I present myself into the world. And there, I think in the later years, I was able to sort of embrace and say, I don't need to choose, I can be both. So yeah.
Thank you, Linda. We actually have a question from Matthew Rivera, and maybe you can distinguish this too, but what the difference you think for you would have been between identity confusion and identity crisis?
I think the identity crisis probably happened when I was a child. I was trying to make this a bit more to the point, but identity crisis is for me going to school and being picked at because I mean, I'll be vulnerable. Like I remember vividly having friends make comments about like the food that I ate, or like I had a certain smell of Asian when I would go to class. So that's a crisis because I felt completely ostracized. I'm not sure if there's a word that's less isolated and just sort of ashamed. And so I was really trying to, um, it was like, I didn't want to accept it type of experience versus identity confusion. I think it's more like, who am I? Like I'm having an existential, like, who am I in terms of like the way I'm going to present myself into the world? That's how I can sort of answer that question.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for that.
Barriers. This one's like a heavy one, so I try to bring some soft, kind of like segue to it. For me, a barrier is something that's essentially like a big loss. So family, it was a big loss in my family when I was very young. 22 years old, I lost my father. So that was like extremely traumatic. And I think that really has been the catalyst of my development in a really good way. And so I always talk about that because it's really shaped a lot of my life decisions and also shaped a lot of important skills that I've learned as an adult. And so the next slide talks about how I became that obstacle. That definitely felt like Erickson's identity crisis of like, what am I going to do with my life? Not necessarily literally, but it just felt like the weight of the world was on me. And there was so much like, how do I make decisions moving forward? So that's where I decided to return to school and sort of immerse myself, not just into being searching for like a literal career path or profession, but like an inward journey of like self-discovery and what do I value? How do I want to live my life? How do I want to contribute to the world? So I think that was definitely those components helped me like hone into going like school becoming so important and really redefining like my strengths and abilities in not just overcoming like the loss of someone so important, but also these skills that I'm going to present into my profession and as I continue at different stages of my life. There is a question here that says, I think something about how my identity connects with others. And I think I was trying to say I'm like adaptable, but I wanted to give something visual. And the only thing that came to mind was like a chameleon, because I don't necessarily think that being Chinese and Mexican is sufficient to like be able to connect with everyone. Those are just two like cultures and so much more out there. But I do feel that there are some things that I can pull that can provide space for others or learn from others. So I thought that sense of like what it felt like to be uncomfortable, but then adapt to a new environment, or that feeling of like, how do I learn from being more Asian and take the things that work and then leave what doesn't. So I feel like a chameleon sort of embodies that. So that in my day-to-day in my profession is like identifying with like transfer students, or like similar upbringings, or different upbringings, but a sense of not belonging. That's something that I can relate to. So turning that discomfort into something positive and making it so students feel heard, or people feel that they matter. And I think there was like a question about what I wish Latinx people would know, or what people would know about Latinx community. And I mean, essentially, we are an extremely diverse community. Like, we are Latinx and Asian, we're Latinx and Afro-Latino, or Peruvian, Japanese. Like, there's so much beautiful like mixture that I think that is so great. We need to celebrate that. This is just my personal, take it as you will. It's a journey, I think, having multiple identities in general, not even talking about race. We're talking about just we're multi-dimensional people. So really coming into the sense of self, it's a process. And I think we're the ones that we get to define that, not boxes or labels. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Linda. I really appreciate your sharing so many different parts of you and your personal experiences. Thank you. So now we're going to go ahead and hand it over to Nancy so that she can go ahead and speak and introduce herself.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Linda, for sharing so many similarities, I believe, in our stories. So I'm glad that you were able to share first, because it definitely, I was like, yes, I know that feeling. So thank you. All right. Perfect. So definitely go over my journey as Asian Latina. I do have different identities, and I just put a few here on the next slide, just a few. My dad is Vietnamese. He was born and raised in Vietnamese, but my grandparents are Chinese and Thai. So he identifies fully as Vietnamese. And that's the culture and ethnic identity I know. So I identify as Vietnamese, Asian, Latinx, Mexican. I use she, her pronouns. I am also first generation. And that kind of goes into the story there. Now I am an educator, which is also part of my journey, a big part of my identity, and a daughter. I think when you are a daughter of immigrant parents, and you are a daughter of different, races, that identity is a bigger part than maybe other families. So I wanted to add that in there. So we go on to the next slide. So as I said before, my identity, I identify as Mexican, Vietnamese, or Asian Latina. So those are the current identity markers that I use now. My dad is a refugee from Vietnam who came during the Vietnam War. And my mother migrated from Mexico, escaping poverty. So those are how they met here in Orange County of Santa Ana. And there is a big Vietnamese population there and a big Mexican population there. And then I moved to the San Fernando Valley with my mom once they separated. I also grew up in a low-income household, so first generation, low income, and I grew up speaking Spanish and Vietnamese at home up until I'm about 5, 6. I learned English in school, so I was an ESL student. Now it's known as ELD. Now I only speak Spanish and English. So once my parents separated, I learned a little bit less Vietnamese, little by little. Trying to reconnect that piece, but it's not the same. And I was raised as both Catholic and Buddhist. My dad was Buddhist, my mom was Catholic, and now I identify as atheist. So it was really nice to grow up with both religions and, be able to choose for myself, but a mixture of not only ethnic identity, like races, culture, but also food. I'm thinking music, I'm thinking religion, so much in the household growing up. So we went to the next slide. So my educational journey, I'm also a non-traditional student in the sense I didn't go straight to a 4-year college, which is normally what, we hear a lot about. I'm a high school counselor, so that's normally what's pushed nowadays. And I wanted to share the number of years it took me to complete because I backtracked, I went forward, backtracked again. And I think that's some of the struggles we see for first generation students, especially when your parents are immigrants and don't know how to navigate the educational system, right? So I graduated from school in Silmar High School to be exact. And then I was accepted into UCSB. UCSB is a 4-year college, but I was only there a semester. And then I returned back home. Navigating the university system was very overwhelming, right? And when you come from a background where community is so huge and staying close to family is so huge, both with the Mexican side and the Vietnamese side, it became really tough to try to, navigate the world on my own. And when you enter a system that a lot of the students there are born here or they're full-on American or whatever it may be, and individualism is highlighted and it's totally the norm, right? But when you're first generation, that is not the norm. So breaking those barriers is very difficult. So I came back and I enrolled at community college. So I went to Mission College with the idea of I'll go back to UCSB, but that didn't happen. I transferred to UCLA. I did get my AA in political science and Chicanic studies at Mission College. And then I transferred to UCLA for year 3 to 5. After 2 years, I did finish my BA in Chicano studies, and I did a minor in labor and workplace studies. After that, I took a gap year. I figured it's going to be either law school or it's going to be in education. But I returned to grad school after the year, and I did my master's in educational counseling from the University of Laverne. So that's why I'm a high school counselor now. Now I'm actively trying to work. Again, being first generation, you feel so fulfilled and you feel like your experiences are only validated sometimes based on education, especially from your Asian side. Your experiences are, what do you have to prove in education in order to prove that you have done something in this life, right? So it's a continuous struggle to try to actively feel fulfilled without education. So right now I'm no longer in school and just enjoying having my career. That took 8 years. So then I went into my career journey while in undergrad. A lot of it was financial aid, and the other half was working part-time in after-school program for flexibility. And after that, I went to work for a small law firm, and that's when I realized law was not for me. I was hoping to do immigration law, but it was also overwhelming. One, I did not like the environment. I couldn't just be in an office. I'm pretty extroverted. So being in an office in front of the computer was not the life for me. And I realized that quickly. And just seeing how the immigration system is built for failure in a sense, right? And so difficult for immigrants to navigate. The impact that I felt that I would have been making was minuscule compared to what I felt I could make as an impact as an educator. And I do now as a counselor, right? I make individual impact through my students, but also through my families, and then as a result, communities. But having to break additional barriers because the system is so unfair in immigration, in trying to get paperwork, it was too overwhelming for me. And then I went on to become college advisor, and that's where I know Carla. I worked as a college advisor first under UCLA with Gear Up Grant, and then I followed through with a full-time job at a nonprofit as a college advisor, and just kept moving and navigating that college career advisor, college career coordinator, manager. And that's when I knew education was it for me. And now I work as a high school academic counselor for a charter school here in the San Fernando Valley. So it's really fulfilling. It goes full circle. I get to understand my students, their families. I work only 10 minutes away from where I grew up. So it's really nice to come back and serve the community once again. So the perception of Latinidad for me, growing up, similar to Linda, right? There wasn't anybody that I could easily find to relate to in terms of you're also Latina and you also have this Asian side, especially when I moved to the San Fernando Valley so young. And the majority in the San Fernando Valley, where I grew up in Silmar, San Fernando, Pacoima area, everyone was Latinx. So it was always equated with you are Mexican, Latinidad. And now I feel like it's finally expanded, right? To acknowledge Central Americans, Afro-Latinx, Indigenous folks, so many other populations that were being negated before, and now the voices are finally being heard, and that includes us. So it was difficult, like Linda said, growing up and having everyone look so different from yourself, but you understanding that culture so well. And that's when you have that identity crisis confusion. Now, I do feel like it's a melting pot, and I'm so happy for that. Just last Chinese New Year's, I went to the fair in Orange County, and there were so many babies that were half Asian, half Latinx, and it was just beautiful to see, right? And just, I got this from the San Diego Tribune, that's at least 250,000 of us now just in LA County alone. So it's beautiful to see, because now these babies have others that look like themselves and can come, they can talk about their similarities. But it was difficult. And I think the difficult part was that it felt I felt very excluded at times, right? Especially when it came to the Latinidad pride, right? It felt very much, we're prideful of our culture and our roots, but it's also contingent of whether you look like us. And so that's hard to explain unless you are someone that, has that experience where you maybe don't look like what what others might feel. Yes, thank you for that, Kevin. So there's so many similarities though, and I feel so privileged to have been able to be born half Vietnamese and half Mexican, because the culture is so similar, which made it not an easy experience, but it made it an easier experience in terms, again, of the collectivism, the community piece that is so valued in both cultures instead of individualism, right? And then the proximity of both communities has created like this new space for everyone. So I'm thinking Santa Ana, I'm thinking Montebello, Garden Grove, so many communities now where we work and live side by side. And that's how my parents got to know each other. Professor Lacey Abrego at UCLA talked about how many Vietnamese folks owned, why can't I think about the word? They created the clothes, I just blinked out, shops where they created the clothes. And seamstress, yes, right? So there were a lot, my mom was a seamstress and my Vietnamese father was a manager there. So it was nice for them to be able to meet in that space. And perception of self, just like Linda said, and Linda, I completely agree with you. It wasn't until my mid-20s that I validated my own experiences and I felt confident. I also had an identity, I said crisis, because for me it was like true on crisis. I actually identified more as Latina because when my parents separated, I went with my mom to the San Fernando Valley. So that's what I knew mostly. And when I saw my dad, I'd still see my dad, but it wasn't as often. So my cultural roots at the time was like, I'm Mexican, I don't know Vietnamese. I eat Vietnamese food when I see my dad. I don't listen to the music. It's very different, right? So, but because of that, growing up around San Fernando Valley, I don't look Mexican. I very much, have been told I look mostly Asian. So that contributed to my identity crisis up until my mid-20s. And that was heavily tied again to language and appearance for me. And that did influence a lot of internalized racism, right? And having to even say that out loud to others as to, oh, well, really, statements like I'm Mexican, or well, my mom's Mexican, so I mostly identify Mexican. A lot of like self-internalized racism, self-hate that I felt the need to say in order to be able to adapt to the population around me. So that was an identity crisis for me up again until to my mid-20s. And what I do see now though is that the mix of being multiracial has influenced my values and beliefs for the better. I embrace diversity fully. I understand it fully. And I think that's something different if I weren't multiracial. And the way I overcame it through solidarity. So folks who provided a safe space for me, exposure. When I got to UCLA, I believe Professor Chow was there. And he was the first one that talked about the Chinese that lived in Mexico City, right? And how so many immigrants now from Mexico City are also Chinese and Mexican. And I was just like, wait, there's a whole other population. And meeting others at UCLA that were also multiracial as I was. And just through learning the history, learning my own history, I became confident of my multiracial background. Facing racism at home, I know it was a question about racism, happened a lot. So I definitely served as a token Asian. It still happens to this day, unfortunately. So a lot of relearning that just gets very exhausting to teach. And again, you're that token Asian teaching others. I'm thinking few examples at work being asked outright if I speak Chinese, like just because, you know, there's very few Asian folks at work, right? At school being the model minority, and having that pressure to be the model minority. If you have a chance, I definitely do the research on the model minority, especially if you're in education. Thinking about the AAPI hate crimes, right? That was very heavy last year. And because I do have friends who are of Latina background, they felt like it was comfortable enough to say like, oh my God, I can't believe COVID, like Asian people, Chinese people. And these are friends I may have had since I was young, but they feel like I can confide in you to tell you this. And again, they negate part of your identity, right? It's choosing when to see when you're Asian and when you're Mexican. So the hate crimes definitely hit hard. I had my dad, who was Vietnamese, not wanting to come out as often until everything was over. And that was difficult to see. Having to compartmentalize myself for the comfortability of others. That was also an ongoing theme in my life, having to choose what do you really identify as? Or no, you're really Mexican because your mom's this. Or well, no, well, you look Asian, so you're Asian. And having like just the pressure, not even the peer pressure, pressuring myself to feel the need to do that in order for others to feel comfortable. And once I realized that the only reason I was putting myself in a box or others were putting me in a box was just for their comfort, I stopped doing that, right? And that's part of the confidence piece, where we're no longer doing things for others to feel comfortable. And having to negate in order to relate. So negating a side of me, whether it's the Vietnamese side or the Mexican side, in order for somebody to relate to me as so I can be a whole on both sides, right? And I stopped doing that as well. But that was something that was expected of me very often. Like when you're around us, you're really Mexican. No, I'm always both. I'm always multiracial, and there's no reason to have to not acknowledge one identity in order for you to feel comfortable. And overcoming, what does that look like? Reteaching harmful language, the language of calling someone China, or my neighbors are Chinos, or whatever it may be. Although I get the response a lot of, well, that's just what we knew, that's what we grew up with. It's okay to reteach traditions and language that is harmful, and language has a negative impact on our mental health, on our well-being, and it's okay to say that out loud. So reteaching that harmful language with colleagues, friends, family, validating my own experiences, right? And I get a lot of, well, in high school, you didn't really say anything. Well, I mean, I was 15, 16, I didn't know any better, right? So validating my experiences, being okay with, not having had the confidence to say anything before, and using my ability to speak Spanish as a tool. So because I do work in a community that speaks Spanish every day, I use my Spanish. And I make sure to say my last name. My last name is difficult to pronounce for a lot of folks, even though it's 4 letters. And I do not give shortcuts now. It's not Miss T, it's not Miss anything, Miss Nancy, it's not Nancy, it's Miss Tiet. And whether you speak English or you don't speak English, whether you only speak Spanish, I like my name fully said. Owning my own cultural practices in all spaces, no longer negating any practice just because it makes other uncomfortable. Connecting to my roots, visiting Vietnam and visiting Mexico was a huge, it was very self-healing for myself. And I think that I needed that in order to understand who I was. So I saw when I went to Vietnam, a lot of cultural pieces I didn't even know I was doing because it was a cultural piece. And then critiquing traditions are harmful, and saying like, it's okay to critique those traditions. It's not that we don't appreciate those traditions, right? But we can acknowledge when they are harmful towards us and maybe towards others. Calling out microaggressions, calling in microaggressions, something that I'm working on. But as soon as they happen, no longer, hey, I'm just gonna let that one fly. I no longer do that. If I hear a microaggression, I'm very comfortable speaking up about it now, something that I would have not done before. So that's what overcoming the racism at home, in the community, my friends, family looks like to me. And how I connect with others. As an educator, I try to create safe spaces for my AAPI students. I have students who are also multiracial like myself, or I have students who are fully Vietnamese, fully Chinese, and they do go to school that's at least 95% Latinx. So I created a safe space for them during the hate crimes, not only for them to talk about their experiences, but for the other students who are not of Asian background to hear their stories and hear what they've been going through and how difficult it is. And that exposure is what I wish I would have had earlier. Discussing problematic interactions on social media. I'm a huge proponent of that. And I think Carla knows that. And the reason I do that is because sometimes we don't know what's wrong until we hear someone else call it in. And so now I'm comfortable talking about that experience in order for others to learn. Again, being mindful of harmful language. Other ways, I don't demand to know someone's identity. And I think it's very weird when people do, because I've experienced it so much. I've gotten no, you're not Mexican, speak Spanish, as if I'm just going to do it on command, right? So I don't do any of that. I don't make assumptions, and I share by choice. And sometimes I'm too exhausted to share my identity, and I do not. And I've been okay with that now. So questions we got. One thing I wish people knew about the Latinx community, we are incredibly diverse, like Linda talked about. One piece of advice is those within the Latinx community, creating a safe space for all, right? And some of the examples I gave. And my inspiration, I think my parents, because I can't imagine being in a multiracial relationship. My dad actually taught my mom a lot of her English. So I don't even know how to communicate it. But just being brave enough to be in that relationship to begin with. Loving versus Virginia was just overturned, I believe, in the late 1960s, the early 1970s. Interracial marriages were banned at that point. They weren't allowed. So that was only, a couple decades before my parents decided to get married. So I think they're very brave for doing that at a time that wasn't normalized. But that's my story. Thank you so much. Oh, some pictures I have. Here are my parents and my brother. I have an older brother who lives in Mexico, and a little bit of my culture here. And yeah, just wanted to share a little glimpse. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nancy. We do have a question for both you and Linda in the chat by Shelby. She says, thank you so much for sharing your experiences, very powerful life experiences and stories. I wonder if either of you have perspectives on whether being an only child versus having siblings has an impact on your multiracial identity development. For example, perhaps there would be built-in solidarity in the household.
I can add to that. I'm an only child here. My older brother, we have different fathers. So he was born and raised in Mexico. Even though I visit him every year, he visits me too. It's very different. So technically I was raised an only child here. So there wasn't even a sibling for me to compare myself to in terms of like, we're both going through this experience as multiracial people together, right? And it wasn't common to even see with other friends or family members. So I think that's why maybe I identified it as a crisis instead of confusion, right? And from early on up until I was 26, right away, I think it was a lot more difficult.
Linda, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of this answer, but then I don't know if it's appropriate. So I guess I'm just gonna stab at it. But my daughters are also mixed, not just from me, but from their father. So like their dad is Mexican Japanese and I'm Mexican Chinese. So like they're extremely mixed. And so if I can share a story of their experience, and I can't speak for them, but I just recall, like, I think it's more of a positive experience because I remember, this is a silly story. I would buy them treats for like snacks for school when they're in elementary, and that was like seaweed and like rice cakes and things like that are very Japanese or Chinese or whatever. And a lot of their friends at the time were not as diverse as they were, but it seemed like a positive experience for them because we would go to like Trader Joe's and then they would ask for like extra seaweed, and I'd ask like, why so much seaweed? And they would say like, oh, our friends like our seaweed, so we're just gonna take an extra pack. And I thought, oh, it was just nice to, so I don't know if that answers the question, but at least they were able to relate to one another in that experience. In my perspective, I can't speak for them, so I thought I'd share that.
Yeah, definitely. And it can also be just like generational gaps, right? We're becoming even more of a melting pot, as Nancy has stated before, and so many different identities and backgrounds, and the politically conscious on the social media, and individuals are so much more exposed to others. It could definitely see like the difference, right? Versus you having that experience where you had that shame maybe surrounding you bringing your food. Your daughters had a completely different experience where they felt accepted in what they were bringing and sharing with their group. Definitely. Thank you, Linda. Okay, I wanted to open it up. Linda and Nancy shared so many aspects of their experiences and their stories and their cultures, and I wanted to open up to questions that you all might have for Linda or Nancy. You can type it in the chat too. Orlando put, what advice do you have for students struggling with their identity or self-acceptance? Thank you, Orlando.
I think it was this like advice question. I think that's what I heard, right?
Yes.
I always try to stray away from advice because I'm like, no two people are the same. But I wouldn't say advice. It'd be more like sharing what worked with me. And I think a lot of I really go back to education because I'm thinking about like courses that I took that really touch upon like for instance, like I took a Chicana class and it really just, I think I needed that because I didn't have as much connection to like my Mexican culture. And I felt like this is so much more like deeper than just my experience. There's so much like other areas that I think even my parents and my grandmother, and I always think about my grandmothers because they were first immigrants here. So like, if it's challenging for me, how would it have been for them? So like the education piece, the like scaffolding and like trying to learn it. It doesn't have to be from a formal aspect. It can be through like an artistic form or like, connecting with communities. So I think that was very beneficial for me.
I think for me, it would be it's okay to call out, not to call out, it's okay to say when you're uncomfortable, right? If someone makes you uncomfortable, whether it's a racist remark, a microaggression, that's okay to say something. And it's also okay to forgive yourself if you felt like I should have said something and I did not. Because again, we are not the token person. We're not this martyr that has to do all this work, right? Of reteaching and all that. But to say like, hey, I'm not comfortable with what you said, and calling in folks, right? And examples of, I think, is the language, right? So someone has said like, oh, well, my Chinese, I don't know, friends. And I'm like, oh, what part of China? They're like, well, I don't know if they're actually Chinese, right? And I'm like, okay, well then, right? And that's when they start questioning, like, oh, maybe I shouldn't have said that. So calling in folks is okay. I think that's something I wish I was more comfortable with earlier on.
Can I ask what made you feel more confident in being able to call in people to those conversations or pointing that out?
Like Linda, I think there was a lot of power through education, right? You don't know what you don't know. So until you learn the experiences of others and the injustices that others have faced, and you see how these microaggressions add up to those injustices and those stereotypes, you're no longer comfortable just being someone that stays quiet. Like you feel the need to say something now because then I'm becoming part of the system. And again, you don't have to be the martyr that's going to reteach everyone, but I think exposure to history, exposure in the system that we have now, just learning at school. I think when it started at UCLA, that's when I really thought like, okay, this is not just an individual experience of mine. It's happening all over. So I can continue to say that thing and just hold it in, or I can call people in now.
Yeah, and I mean, Orlando stated, the for self-forgiveness part is something I think a lot of individuals might have challenges with, and those memories and those feelings and like the shame I think we talk about can kind of follow us too, and that's important of like, the mental health too, that the impact, right, those microaggressions can have on us as we develop and as we grow. And I don't know if you all are open in expressing like, how has it impacted your mental health, or how has it not impacted your mental health, and how maybe you overcame that or are currently overcoming it.
In terms of mental health, when you are multiracial, during a time, like Linda said, right, the 90s, early 2000s, even during a time where there's not a lot of multiracial folks that around, your identity truly impacts your mental health. It becomes a big part of it. As to someone else, I like, hey, what impacts me is maybe I don't know, like the fact that I was low income, or the fact that, I am first gen or immigrant parents, but like being multiracial becomes a huge trigger in, I feel, your mental health. And so I think that led to a lot of internalized racism and self-hate. And it took a lot of learning again and exposure to overcome that. I'm a huge mental health advocate because I am in the mental health field. So overcoming that was only until I felt safe to do that, right? So safe, which is why I'm an advocate about creating safe spaces for my students. They're not, when I did that to my students, all of a sudden, like all these stories about bullying came out. Like, I've been bullied because I bring this for lunch, like Linda was talking about, right? I've been bullied because they've called me these names before. Nothing that they would have told me individually in my office. These students would have never, they would have been like, my life is perfect, miss. Like, thank you, I'm fine. So creating those safe spaces and having others who you can relate to, I think is a key to that. But yeah, in terms of my mental health, lots of therapy, lots of exposure, lots of learning that I had to do, right? Because being multiracial during that time was just not easy. And it's still, I still get triggers now, right? Especially like through Mexican traditions, Vietnamese traditions. I'm like, that piece was not kind to me when I was growing up. And so it trickles down to other traditions. So yeah, a lot of work.
Did you want to add anything, Linda?
It's been a little while since I've thought about this, so I'm trying to draw, like, I think a very pivotal time for me was in my 20s, because it was around the same time that I was becoming a parent. So 2 multiracial children. So I think in a very interesting way, while I was sorting out my own identity and figuring out like, how is that going to shape them? It was like a interesting holistic healing process, because the conversations that I was having with them was about intersectionality, and not just in terms of identity like race, but identity being a woman, identity, like, these are conversations that we had at the table on a day-to-day basis. And so I think the power of like conversation really is healing, but it also is very powerful because it's like being a change agent. And I think that just is my everyday conversation. Some people that are in this, meeting, that know me, I talk about this every day. It's part of my language. So it's part of my identity. I talk about things like normalize my experience, and it's who I am, and I carry all of these identities. So I think that's how I sort of reshape it to be my mental health is me prioritizing and carrying myself fully as a complex person. I think that's how I would say it. So
Thank you. Shelby asked in the questions, what's your favorite part about being Asian Latina?
I'm gonna go first. Everybody says the food, but like truly, it is more than just the food for me. So growing up, we did this thing every like 2 weeks or every weekend with my family, and we would do like banquet style dinners. And at first, it felt very like mundane. This is what we do. But my father was always very intentional on everything we did and explaining as to what's why. And so what he explained to me was that having like each dish that is being brought into like the table, I see people shaking, nodding, like the soup, or like every dish embodies something, but it's the experience of sitting at the table together and like communing and sharing like something so sacred. And that's how he taught me like that a value is family. So it's not just the food, it's a symbol.
Thank you.
I'm gonna add on to that. Yes, food for me, because I mean, who doesn't love tacos? And then we have pho, we have mboe, like so many good foods, right? But because I think about the way my parents tried to navigate being, trying to raise me with two different cultures, and it ties so much to food, right? So growing up, my dad would make spring rolls. My mom knows how to make pho. She's Mexican. She can make all the Vietnamese staples. So we would eat spring rolls. And she would always call them tacos blancos, which translates to white tacos. So growing up, I would just tell my friends, you want to come? We're going to eat some tacos blancos. And be like, yeah. And it wasn't until I was way older that I was like, oh, everybody calls them spring rolls. These are not tacos blancos, So then those are the little memories where the food relates to how they were trying to navigate growing, trying to raise somebody that is multiracial, which they didn't prepare for, but they were just doing their best. So I think about food also, and I think about those memories.
That's such an awesome memory. Yeah, I think that community and that the culture really is just like embedded into the culture. That is what the culture is. That is within the family. And that is really, Kevin said, that's such a sweet memory. That is a really sweet memory. Awesome. Kevin also said, thank you, powerful stuff. And thank you both for being so vulnerable and sharing your stories. He was wondering, were either of you involved in any clubs and organizations while in school that helped you explore your multiracial identity? No.
Definitely was it. Being a Chicana studies major definitely helped me out a lot. It wasn't a club, but it was eye-opening. Now, because I am at high school, there are so many clubs and surrounding about like, let's embrace all races and let's talk about culture. And so I see that I'm like, I wish I had that before. That's so exciting. But I also had a little self-hate, internalized racism there. So I don't know if I would have taken advantage of that. Maybe there was something, right? But I love to see it now. I wish I would have.
Yeah, definitely. Awesome. Linda, want to add on or good?
Definitely I cannot think of. What I will say is I did attend a high school that was very diverse. by luck, or I'm not sure what that would be called. I went to John Marshall High School, and I mean, that's essentially where I met the father of my children. He was Japanese Mexican, and then we had friends who were Vietnamese and something else. So I think I was, in a way, it was probably high school when I was like seeing, it wasn't as common as now, but there was a few friends that I remember being also multiracial, and that just in itself felt a little bit more comforting.
Mhm. Yeah, definitely. The community, right? I mean, the people who you were able to surround yourself with, even if it wasn't a club, or even if it was an after school activity, it really did help in that sense too. Amazing. Well, any last other questions that you all have for Linda or Nancy for today? Give it a minute. Okay. Well, I want to thank, Nancy and Linda for sharing their unique stories and providing us insight on their personal experiences today, and just really highlighting, the diverse and pluralism that exists within the Latinx community. And I hope, this is something that you all can take away, and understanding just the pluralism that really exists out there. And I really do appreciate Nancy and Linda for being so open about your experiences in growing up Asian Latinas. Thank you so much for being here today. Yeah, everyone's saying thank you. We appreciate your stories and experiences and your journeys, and for being so open and honest. Thank you all. I'm going to put the sign in just once more in case y'all didn't have a chance to sign in. Please do so. Awesome. Thank you, Linda and MC.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.